Welcome back, everyone. Today we're making a button-up shirt. And this shirt can be made for anyone because I'm gonna be showing you how to take this pattern and make it based on your measurements or based on a style, whether that's oversized, crop, fit, tall. Pretty much any style you think of can be made with this one pattern. And if you're new to sewing, you should have no problem following the easy step-by-step tutorial. With all that being said, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you'll need up to 2 yards for your main fabric, and this can range anywhere between a non-stretch fabric and a stretch fabric. And if you're just starting out, the easiest fabric to work with is a cotton fabric, and that's what I'm going to be using for the video. I'm going to be using 2 different fabrics, and they're both cotton. But at the end of the video, I'm also going to be showing you an example made out of stretch material. You make the button up the same for both materials, it's just that when you're working with the stretch material, it's a little bit harder to get that collar perfect, so you might want to practice with the cotton material before you go into a stretch material. But like always, get creative with it and use whatever fabric that you want to use. You'll need 3/4 yard of midway interfacing, and this is going to be used for the collar band in the collar. It is optional if you don't want the collar to be too stiff. If you want more of that wrinkle flexible look, you don't need interfacing. You'll need 6 to 12 buttons, and this is based on how many buttons you want to put down the front, on the sides, on the collar, and on the collar band. There's a lot of places you can add buttons, so you can go all the way up to 12 buttons or more. When it comes to the size and the style of the button, there's really no limits. And again, it's going to be based on your preference and what looks best with your fabric. Lastly, you'll need your pattern, and the pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is print it out, tape it together, and you're ready to go. After printing out your pattern, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is going to allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. Once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting. After taping your pattern together, it should look like this. And be sure to check your printer alignment for the best possible results. As you can see, we trimmed the top and the right side of the pattern. Doing this makes it so much easier to overlap those pages and tape them together for a perfectly aligned pattern. Before you start cutting the pattern, you can see at the bottom there's 2 different styles. We have the curved up bottom and then just the straight flat bottom. I wanted to add this into the pattern because it's a very fun detail, because you don't always want that curved up bottom. Sometimes you want it flat, or sometimes you want to make your own design, and you can do that as well. And when it comes to the sizing, I made a size chart for the width, height, and sleeve. The sizing doesn't really matter all that much because I'm going to show you how you can make this for your exact fit or the style you're trying to make. And you can achieve that with just these 3 basic measurements. So what I like to recommend is picking a size that's close to what you're looking for, and then from there we can fine tune it to your exact fit, and I'm going to show you how to do that throughout this tutorial. For example, I'm going to be picking the large. It's a little bit on the big side, but I'm going to be taking it in on the sides, and I'm also going to be adding a little bit of length. But anyways, moving on, once you found that size, you're going to cut on the outside of the black or dotted line. And if your measurement falls in between the line, I would go to the next size up, so that way we can trim it down once we get going. After cutting out your fabric, you should end up with 1 pocket panel cut out of your main fabric, 3 collar panels, 2 cut out of your main fabric, and 1 cut out of your interfacing. 3 collar band panels, 2 cut out of your main fabric, and 1 cut out of your interfacing. 2 sleeve panels, both cut out of your main fabric. 2 back body yoke panels cut out of your main fabric on the fold. 1 back body panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold. This is a big panel to cut on the fold, so if you want to mirror the pattern and cut it, that works too. And lastly, 2 front body panels cut out of your main fabric. And real quick before we move on, I want to go over adjusting the length. If you want to shorten this or add on some length to the bottom, you do it from this cut point. So if you're looking to add length, you cut on the guide and you add paper in between and tape it all together. Or if you're looking to shorten it, you're going to cut it on the guide and overlap the top and bottom of that panel to the point you want. If you do change the length of the front or back panel, make sure you do the same thing to the opposite front or back panel, because if you don't change it, the side seams will not line up. Don't overthink it because this is a minor adjustment. Keep in mind you want to make room for the hem at the bottom, so it's best to go a little bit bigger because at the end you can try it on and trim it down from there. And the last thing before we get started with assembly, you don't need to cut any panels out for the button guide panel. This is simply just a guide we lay on the shirt at the end of construction to help lay out the buttons. So we can place that off to the side, and starting with construction, we're going to grab the back body panel, locate the top edge, and that's going to be the shortest flat side. With the side located, we're going to place the pattern out with the right sides facing up, grab both of the back body yoke panels, locate the bottom edge, and that's going to be the longest flat side. Lay the panels out flat and figure out what side is your right side. Place the right side of the first yoke to the right side of the body and the right side of the second yoke to the wrong side of the body and stitch that top edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Keep in mind we lined up the bottom of the yoke with the top of the back body. Pull both of the yoke panels out so the wrong sides are together and try to line the outside edge up as neat as possible. We're going to be adding a top stitch, but before we do that, we're going to get it as neat and flat as possible by pressing it out. And these small details really bring out a professional looking shirt. Add a top stitch on the yoke side, and I'm using an edge presser foot to get a nice even stitch. Top stitching is optional, but it does bring in a whole nother durability factor, because you're essentially just adding one more stitch, locking all those panels together, making for a stronger finish. Place the complete back panel off to the side and grab your front body panels. Using the pattern, we're going to locate the edge that has the outside edge and the fold guides. This step, we're going to be folding that outside edge over, and we're going to be doing the same thing for both of the front panels so we can place one off to the side so we can focus on one at a time. Mark out the fold guides on both sides of the pattern, and we're going to be doing this on the right side of the fabric. Connect the points with the ruler, and you should end up with 2 straight lines in the same position to the fold guides on the pattern. I like to flip it over to the wrong side, fold one line, and then fold the second line so the raw edge is completely gone. From here, we're going to press it out, and we're trying to make it as flat as possible. As you can see, the edge is pressed, it's flat, and the raw edge is hidden. Before we go any further, we're going to grab the second front body panel and do the exact same thing. And the overall goal is to get both of these panels as identical as possible. From here, we're going to be adding a top stitch on the inside edge of that fold to both of the panels. And a quick tip is matching your thread color to your fabric color because it's going to help hide any imperfections within that stitch. These stitches will be front and center, so any little imperfections will be noticeable. I'm only adding 1 stitch per panel, but feel free to add more stitches on that fold. And another fun thing to do is to cut out that fold strip and replace it with a different fabric. So if you're working with an accent fabric, sometimes you can replace it with that fabric and it looks pretty cool. But anyways, moving on, grab the complete back panel, lay it out with right sides facing up, grab both of the front panels that we just worked on, locate the shoulder edge on the front and back panel. The back panel is going to have 2 layers, and we're going to use that to our advantage. We're going to separate both of the layers, place the right side together for the front and back panel, move to the bottom edge and start rolling it up like a scroll as tight as possible. Roll it right over the back yoke, and then we're going to stretch that back yoke around to the wrong side of the front panel. Line up the shoulder edges and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After finishing up the stitch, we're going to flip the right sides out. You kind of just have to push that body panel out to the side and it'll eventually pop out. And the main reason we did this technique is so that way we hide that raw edge on the inside of the shirt. Just like in the previous steps with the back yoke, we're going to add a top stitch to the yoke side. This stitch is going to secure the layers down so the yoke panel's not moving around. And again, it's also going to add another layer of durability so it doesn't rip at those shoulder seams. This will now become our body assembly, and we can place this off to the side and grab our collar panels. We'll be adding a midway interfacing to the collar to give it a little bit of structure. If you choose to not add the interfacing, you can skip this next step. Another quick thing to note is the width of the collar. At this point, you can change it. You can make it bigger or smaller just by cutting it and changing the overall width. But anyways, place one of the panels off to the side, take the interfacing, place it on the wrong side of the fabric. If you're using adhesive interfacing like me, press it on. Flip the interfacing side so the right side is facing up, grab the second collar panel and stitch the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving the bottom edge open. The bottom edge is the curve that faces in towards the center of the collar panel. I like to snip the corners to reduce a little bit of bulk so you get a nice perfect corner when you flip the right sides out. Flip the right sides out through the bottom edge opening, poke the corners out using something sharp like scissors. Line up the outside edges and press both sides to get it as flat as possible. Once you're satisfied with the look, we're going to add a top stitch around the outside edge, once again leaving that bottom edge unstitched. Just like in previous steps, I highly recommend matching the thread color to your fabric color to hide any little imperfections. Out of all the top stitching, this is one that I highly recommend doing. You shouldn't skip this one because it really brings that collar together. Place the complete collar off to the side and grab the collar band panels. We're going to be doing the same thing we did for the collar. Place one of the panels off to the side, line up the interfacing on the wrong side of the collar band panel, and press it down if you're using adhesive backed interfacing. Flip the collar band over to the interfacing side, grab the pattern, locate the collar edge. We'll be working on the opposite side to the collar edge. What we're trying to do is roll that edge over 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to show you a quick trick for doing this perfectly. Using cardboard, cut out the collar panel. Thinner cardboard works best. This will give you a perfect replica of that top edge. Move it down 3/8 of an inch and fold it over the cardboard. I like to fold it all over to make sure that edge is perfectly lined up, and then press it down once you're satisfied with the 3/8 of an inch. And using this technique, the thinner the cardboard is, the easier it is to press. Place the cardboard off to the side, double check your edge. If everything is looking good, grab your second collar band panel. Along with the collar band, grab the complete collar assembly. Using the center guides, line the bottom edge of the collar up with the collar edge of the collar band panel. Place the interfacing collar band over top, sandwiching the collar in between both of the collar band panels, and stitch the collar edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you really want to take your time with this step. Use a guide if you need to. You don't want that collar to be wonky, so it has to be very even around the outside edge. Flip the right side out so the wrong side of the collar bands are together. Face the non-interfacing collar band side up and roll that bottom edge over 3/8 of an inch. We're trying to match the interfacing side, so roll it over the same amount as the interfacing side and press it down. With the bottom edges lined up perfectly, we're going to add a top stitch along the collar edge. This is another top stitch I highly recommend doing because it's going to give a little bit of extra support to hold that collar up. At this point, the collar assembly is ready to install, so if you want to make any changes, you should do them now. Grab the body assembly with the right sides facing up, locate the neckline. Using the center guides, we're going to line up the non-interfacing side on the wrong side of the body panel. The bottom edge of the collar band should line up in the center of the back yoke. Line up the raw edge of the neckline with the raw edge of the collar band. Shift the top portion of the collar panel below the neckline. Add a few pins to prevent the layers from moving around, and from here we're going to stitch that edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Take your time with this stitch and make sure the layers aren't shifting around as you're sewing. Double check to make sure all the layers got stitched together, and from here we're going to flip the opposite side of the collar band over, lining it up with the back collar band panel. An easy way to line it up and keep it flat is pleat the collar with a few pins. This will allow the bottom edge to lay flat, and from here we can line the center and the outside edges up. Keep in mind we're trying to line up the bottom edge of both collar bands as best as we can. Add a top stitch on the bottom edge of the collar band, and if it's lined up correctly, you should get a top stitch on one side and also the same position on the back side. This is the trickiest part of making a button-up shirt. From here on, everything else is super easy. If you nailed this part, your shirt is going to be looking good. And this may take a few times. You can always de-thread it and try it again. And if for some reason your collar band panel doesn't line up, more than likely it's because you're sewing on a bias and that fabric is stretching as you're sewing. It just takes a little getting used to, but after a few tries, you're gonna really get it down. But anyways, we can place this panel off to the side and grab both of our sleeve panels. We'll be working with the curved edge, and that's the edge at the top of the panel. Place the sleeve panel to the side, grab the complete body assembly, locate the sleeve openings, lay the panel out flat with the right sides facing up so you can see the entire edge of the sleeve opening. Determine the right side of your sleeve and take that one sleeve, place it on the sleeve opening, lining up the curved edge of the sleeve with the edge of the sleeve opening. This is a panel I like to sew as I go, but before I do that, the best thing to do is to line up the center to have a center reference point so when you're sewing, you can see if you're lining it up correctly. And we're going to do the exact same thing for the opposite sleeve and sleeve opening. And both of the edges are too curved, that's why I'm not using pins. I like to just sew it as I go for the best results. Typically, the next step would be adding a top stitch, but at this point, I don't like the raw edges on the inside. It just doesn't look good and it's going to fray over time, so what I recommend is either using a serger to serge these edges like I'm doing, or you can use a zigzag stitch and that works just as good as a serger. This is gonna clean up that raw edge on the inside and also prevent fraying over time. It's also gonna add another layer of strength. Flip back over to the right side and we're gonna be adding a top stitch on the body side. So move the seam allowance so it faces towards the body side. So you're gonna be stitching directly on top of the seam allowance on the body side. This seam in the shoulder arm area takes a lot of strain, so by adding this top stitch, you're actually going to make for a longer lasting shirt. I have two different color fabrics along the stitch line, so what I did was jump the one color, then I went back and added the top stitch on the second color with the same color thread. This is another one of those little details that if you add it, it looks really nice. And you'll never find this detail on shirts in the market because it costs too much to add this extra stitch to manufacturing. Place the right sides of the shirt together, lining up the side seams. And that's exactly what we're going to be stitching next. A good way to keep everything lined up is use the outside edges and the shoulder seam as a reference point. From here, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance and repeat this process for the opposite side of the shirt. A big thing to note here is that you want those shoulder seams to line up perfectly because it's going to look weird if they're offset once you put the shirt on and the right sides are out. Just like with the sleeve panels, we're going to clean up that raw edge using a serger or a zigzag stitch. If you plan on making these to sell, you can actually get a serge and a straight stitch all in one machine. So you can condense this down into one step. Shuffle around the shirt so the right sides are facing out. This is also a good time to try the shirt on to see if the width and length is correct. If everything is looking good, we're going to add a top stitch to both of the side seams. I like to move the top stitch so it's facing the back body panel, and then I add my top stitch directly on top of the back body panel, but you can do this on either side. Again, I'm switching out the color thread on the sleeve and the body portion so I can get a nice perfect match. Quickly double check, make sure everything is looking good, and from here we're going to move to the bottom edge. If you're looking for more of a raw edge look, you can skip this step, but what we're going to be doing is hemming that bottom edge and cleaning up the raw edge. We're just simply rolling the edge over a 1/4 inch and then one more 1/4 inch so that way the raw edge is hidden. Place a few pins and press it down. And once you have it all nice and neat, we're going to add a stitch directly on top of the hem. I'm only adding one stitch, feel free to add 2 or more, or even a decorative stitch. After finishing up the stitch, double check to make sure all the layers got stitched together and there's no raw edge sticking out. Sometimes you'll have a little piece sticking out and it's best to fix that now. Spin the shirt so you're facing the sleeve, and we're going to do the exact same thing. Roll the edge in a 1/4 inch and one more 1/4 inch so the raw edge is hidden. You can also refer to the pattern as a guide to help roll that edge on the fold guides. But the best way to do it is actually to put the shirt on and to hem it to exactly where you want it to fall on your arm. For now, I'm just going to roll the edge over twice and do the same thing for the opposite sleeve. The best way to sew the sleeves is to pull out the bed of your sewing machine so that way your sewing machine is more like a cylinder bed sewing machine. This will allow you to slide that sleeve in the sewing machine and sew in a full loop. If your machine doesn't have this feature, it's totally fine, you can do without. After finishing up the stitch, the best thing to do is to try it on, see if it's fitting right. If it's at the right length, you can add another stitch, or what I like to do is roll the edges up and then add another stitch so you have that rolled edge look. But it all comes down to preference and how you want your shirt to fit and feel. But anyways, moving on, slide the shirt so you can see the full center where both of the front panels meet. These panels are going to overlap, and this is another thing that comes down to preference, which side you want upright. Once you figured out what side you want on top, we're going to grab the button guide panel, locate the top edge of the button guide panel, and place it on the top edge of your shirt just below the collar band. I do want to say this is just a guide and a reference point to place buttons. You don't need to add this many buttons. This is a lot of buttons. You can do every other, and you can use any style of button you want. I'm going to be using just a standard small button. I only have 6, so I'm only going to be adding 5 to the front, and the 6th one will go on my pocket. If I had more buttons, I would add a button at each one of these points, but I don't, so I'm just going to space them out evenly along that front. And I'm placing these directly in the center of the folded front edge. Lay them out first to see if it looks good. The one at the bottom edge, I like to stay away from all the way at the bottom because you want that to flap open to go around your hips. Sometimes it can get a little bit tight. You can also add one up on the collar band, directly in the center, right on the edge of the collar band, and also on the collar. I'm not going to be adding buttons here because I think these buttons are a little bit big for those areas, but if you have smaller buttons, feel free to place them on the collar and the collar band. If you're satisfied with the button layout, place the buttons off to the side, and what we're going to do next is place our buttonholes because the buttons are going to go on the inside layer and the buttonhole is going to go on the outside layer. But before we jump into adding the buttonholes, I'm going to be using a buttonhole presser foot. These typically come with your sewing machine. You may have a smaller one or it might look different, but they all work the same. To get this set up correctly, you place a button in the back opening and then you close it shut, and this will give you the exact size buttonhole for the size button you're using. With the size button opening taken care of, we're going to switch the sewing machine to the buttonhole setting. With the sewing machine set to the buttonhole, we're going to move up to the length and move that to the buttonhole setting as well. The last setting is the width, and this is going to be the width of the actual stitch, so if you want a wider one, you go wider, or a smaller stitch, you go smaller. Pop the presser foot on and move the button tab down. This tab switches the drive to move back and forward as you're sewing, so once it's going through that buttonhole, it will hit the tab and move in the opposite direction. Before you jump right in, it's always best to do a test run. I always like to go back and forth twice on my buttonholes. Once you have it on a piece, you snip out the center from side to side, open it up a little bit, grab your button, and see if the button slides through. You kind of want it to be hard to push through so that way it just doesn't pop back out when you're wearing this shirt. but you also don't want it too small so it's hard to put on. There's just that fine little area and it takes a little bit of fine tuning to dial it in. Once you have all the buttonhole settings dialed in, we're going to take it to the shirt and add it on your outer layer. And the biggest thing here is trying to keep them aligned as you're sewing them onto that front fold. Next, we're going to snip the center from end to end. These steps are very time consuming. If you want to pick up production, I highly recommend looking into a buttonhole sewing machine. After snipping the centers, we're going to line that top edge up directly on top of the bottom edge and mark the centers out with chalk. This is a quick and easy way to get the markings for our button placement. When it comes to installing the buttons, you'll want to look into a button presser foot. This holds that button in place with a little grippy end, and you can use it with almost any sewing machine, as long as your sewing machine has a zigzag stitch option, because we're switching it to a zigzag stitch and we're turning the length down to a 0 so it doesn't move around as we're stitching. Be sure to do a nice tack stitch and tie the ends of the thread so it doesn't unravel. And from here you can add a button to the collar band panel or the collar panel, but we're going to place this assembly off to the side and grab our pocket panel. Adding the pocket is optional and you can add more than one. To start, we're going to be rolling the side edges over 1/4 inch and then the top and bottom. Press all the edges so they're nice and flat. If any of the edges are crooked, you'll want to fix that unless that's the look you're going for. Using the pattern, locate the fold guide at the top. Simply just roll that edge over twice and press it down. This will be the size of the finished pocket. If it's too small, you can change the dimensions to make it whatever size you want. Before attaching it to the shirt, I like to add 2 stitches on the fold. This secures the fold down and also adds a look to the top edge. Grab the complete shirt assembly, place it on the right or left side, at the top or bottom, or pretty much wherever you want to place this panel. This is another part that's fun to customize and get creative with it. Once you're completely satisfied with the placement, we're going to add a few pins so it doesn't shift around and stitch the outside edge, and do a nice tack stitch at the start and the stop so that way when you use the pocket it doesn't rip out. The next little detail is optional. I'm going to be adding a button and I'm just placing it in the center top edge of that pocket panel. You don't need to add this. I just like to have this button on the side because it kind of helps with the whole flow of the shirt. Another fun option is adding a flap on top, but there's so many things you can do and you can get creative with it. The final step is adding your branding. I put one on the pocket, on the collar, on the sleeve, and on the back. And I rolled up the sleeve and added on the sleeve so the sleeve doesn't roll out. It's another fun way to do it, or you can add a stitch to the sleeve. But as far as the branding I'm using, it's just a piece of leather branded and added with double-sided rivets. It's simple, easy, and looks nice. I also use this pattern on a highly stretched fabric. It works great and I really like the results. For all of the stitching and top stitching, I did a zigzag stitch. It's a different look, but it looks really cool. The hardest part is adding the collar band to the neckline, and you may need to do it a couple times if you're working with the stretchy fabric. If you're new to sewing, I recommend working with the non-stretch fabric before you jump into stretchy fabric because sometimes it can be a little bit more fussy when you're working with a sewing machine. But other than that, it just takes practice and you'll get it right. And there you have it, your button up is complete. Hopefully yours turned out really good. If it didn't turn out great the first time, these things sometimes do take practice, especially when it comes to the sizing and the fit you're trying to create. I know it took me a few to dial in the size, the length, because since you're making it, you might as well make it to the exact fit you're going for and not just go for a generic store cut that's based off of manufacturing. And that's the beauty of this, is that you can create your own size from this foundation pattern. You don't need to use exactly these sizes. You can cut in between the lines and get the best fit for you. But other than that, I'd love to see what you come up with, so tag me on Instagram at Properfit Clothing. Until then, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.